Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session, From Structural Racism to Racial Justice. My name is Amaris Parks King, and I'm a third-year PhD student in Peace Studies and Sociology here at the University of Notre Dame. I'm both excited and honored to moderate this racial justice-oriented panel and to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Abena Sankofa Imhotep, a student from Drake University and the founder and director of Sankofa Literary and Empowerment Group, an organization that promotes literacy among Black children through the reading and scholarship of books by Black authors. Imhotep will be presenting a research paper entitled Black Nonperformance as a Strategy for Achieving Racial Justice. Also, be sure to check out her wonderful TEDx talk called Iowa Nice Interrupted. Then we will hear from Eric Essling, a student at Tapeta University, as well as a managing director at River Phoenix Center for Peace Building, which you'll hear about in his paper, Dialogue Across Difference, Police-Youth Dialogues for Community Peace Building. After the presentations, we will have a Q&A session. Again, thank you all for joining us to reimagine racial justice. Abena, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Amrist. So today my presentation is called Black Nonperformance as a Strategy for Achieving Racial Justice. Nonperformance is contract law terminology. Nonperformance is the clause in a contract which defines a breach of contract. In one way or another, the nonperformance clause addresses the central question of when is one party's performance due, so that failure to perform will be a breach. Nonperformance is critical refusal and resistance to oppose an agreement or authority. New York University professor and theorist Fred Moten introduced the concept of nonperformance as a methodology in 2015 at the Modern Museum of Art in a talk entitled Black Nonperformance, Blackness and Nonperformance. And he defined nonperformance as not choosing to perform. Despite the cognizance that such demonstrations would summon white fear and imperil their own lives, Black people's assertions of their own humanity through nonperformance would chart a course for realizing their human rights. White racial supremacy represents itself over and again throughout US American history. So this research is one attempt to examine how its particular representation as white fear is embedded into the national imagination through identity contingencies and is codified in the social structures institutions with a specific analysis of human rights, law enforcement, and Black nonperformance. So white fear is the real or imagined perception of danger had by white and white adjacent people when interacting with non-white people. One may question what white racial supremacy would have to fear: difference, sharing power, ceding power, reaping marginalization. Thomas R. West suggests in White Power, White Fear that rather than, quote, owning these fears, whiteness projects them onto others, end quote. White fear is woven into the fabric of the United States institutions as a response to the resistance and non-performance of Black people and other non-white people who refuse to subordinate themselves to inhumane contexts. Critical refusals have historically emboldened the social structure to institutionalize white fear, enacting rules and policies and laws to control the powerless margins and nullify their non-performance. Leslie Alexander and Michelle Alexander denote in the 1619 Project, A New Origin Story by Nicole Hannah-Jones, that white fear of the racialized other is an endemic to our society as a whole. To appreciate the pervasiveness of white fear, one must understand the social structure within which it is framed, and thus the constitutive formation of Black people who exist within it. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, The triangle of trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas exchanged arms and textiles and wine across the Atlantic Ocean, relegating kidnapped Africans to chattel, cargo status, just like sugar and other commodities. Settler colonialism and the commodification of Africans to mass produce cotton, tobacco, and sugar maximized profits for private owners and became a global economic driver. By 1860, a year before the Civil War began, the Confederate States were supplying approximately 80% of the cotton utilized in British cotton mills, attributable to the unpaid labor of chattel Africans on forced labor camps and the inherited enclosure and enslavement of their descendants. Cedric Robinson suggests in the introduction to Black Marxism, quote, "The development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions, and racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism," end quote. Because of the manner in which race and capitalism have been inextricably intertwined, it is imperative to consider racial capitalism the foundational and enduring social structure of the Federalist state. The constitutive formation of Black people has been to organize themselves within their own socio-political, cultural networks under the United States social structure in namely two ways that engender mental emancipation and interpersonal relations. According to Dr. Greg Carr from Howard University, those two formations are namely Black public spheres, which are arenas where Black citizens come together and exchange opinions regarding public affairs and eventually form a public opinion. And secondly, Black convened spaces, Black only, Black centered spaces founded on lived experiences of shared struggle. In a society structured by racial capitalism, which inhibits and restricts the movements of non-white people and predetermines spaces they can occupy, being born Black in America and pursuing life, liberty, and happiness is widely considered aberrant, an act of resistance, of non-performance still. In Eyes Off the Prize, Carol Anderson details multiple occurrences of Black non-performance converging with white fear and terrorism. An Alabama veteran who was shot by a trolley conductor and executed by the sheriff after he removed a Jim Crow sign, removing the sign being an act of non-performance. A South Carolina veteran's eyes were gouged out after he remarked on the absurdity of Jim Crow transportation. A Louisiana veteran was dismembered, castrated, and set aflame for refusing to give a white man a war memento. A Black community in Tennessee was bombarded with gunfire after a group of African-American men refused to let another Black man be lynched, and on and on. These contemporaneous acts of terror were regarded by many leaders as genocide, a legacy of which has flowered into the 21st century, with the police killings of Michael Brown in Missouri, Tatiana Jefferson in Texas, Oscar Grant in California, Tamir Rice in Ohio, Corinne Gaines in Maryland, and on and on. Dr. Anderson reflected on Malcolm X's beseeching of Black Americans that if they would broaden their ideas around the collective struggle for human rights in America, they would have a case for the United Nations. In 1951, January, the United Nations entered a convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. Article 2 of the convention states, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A, killing members of the group. B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Racialized politics in the United States, however, affected its approach to the United Nations. Dr. Anderson's research revealed that the State Department wanted to, quote, shield America from international scorn, end quote, and the optics of being the chief offender against rather than the defender of civil liberties. As Dr. Deborah Dayla ideates in the Global Struggle for Human Rights, state sovereignty is prioritized over widely accepted international human rights laws, gouging a divide between idealistic rhetoric and reality, which in part explains the, quote, continued existence of widespread human rights abuses across the globe, end quote. The United States often renders itself incapable of prosecuting crimes against Black people. Notwithstanding, Black people exact agency through non-performance, turning a mirror, be it strategic or spontaneous, toward a country fraught with white fear and embracing international solidarity, despite a global leadership community which leans towards state sovereignty more so than human rights. The federal government's imagination had been gripped by white fear concerning a woman named Edna Griffin since 1947, as evidenced by nearly 2 decades of FBI surveillance, which alleged her involvement with the local branch of the Communist Party. In 1948, Edna Griffin and friends entered a downtown drugstore in the Midwest, ordered ice cream, and were denied service due to Iowa's race-based discriminatory laws. Employing nonviolent direct action and litigation, Griffin challenged the social structure's segregationist policies of public accommodations well before the 1955 Alabama bus boycotts of Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks. Noah Lawrence writes in a 2008 essay entitled, "Since It Is My Right, I Would Like to Have It, Edna Griffin and the Katz Drugstore Desegregation Movement," that it would be the highly educated Army veteran wife and mother who would be the person willing to do her part in spearheading the grassroots movement. Griffin's 1949 civil trial against Katz Drugstore unfurled the close association of white fear and identity contingencies. Claude Steele describes in Whistling Vivaldi how identity contingencies are the things that you have to deal with in a situation because you have a given social identity, and further suggests that these things are dealt with in order to get what one wants or what one needs. Edna Griffin's attorney, Charles P. Howard, understood that it could prove more effective to recontextualize the identity contingencies of his client and the defendant from discrimination against a Black person by a white person to discrimination against a well-educated and well-respected member of the community by an unpatriotic store owner. Howard and Griffin were aware of how the fears of an all-white jury in a nearly all-white town could influence the metacognition involved in a jury decision, and chose to appeal to the jury's sense of gender standards rather than directly counter racialized fear. Howard's adjusted characterization of Griffin to the jury underscores the notion that Black people in general and Black women in particular are disqualified from existing as the full self, as it would likely lead to an unfavorable conclusion. A human right is, after all, an entitlement believed to belong justifiably to all persons, regardless of social identity. But a human right is no more than an assertion if one is without Professor West's trope of domination to enforce one's own humanity. The criminal legal system, the 5-part institution comprised by police, defense attorneys, prosecuting attorneys, the court, and prisons and jails, which is responsible to enforce laws, has historically tasked itself with enforcing place and policing Black bodies. United States police departments, as Ta-Nehisi Coates patently describes in Between the World and Me, have, quote, been endowed with the authority to destroy the Black body, end quote. After the police killing of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Angela Davis writes her reflections on the subsequent uprisings and protests that occurred in her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. noting that the police reacted with an armed response that revealed the extent to which local police departments have been equipped with military arms, military technology, and military training to the degree that one might have assumed Ferguson was Gaza. The social structure justifies its paramilitary deployment to urban communities as tactical operations. On the contrary, institutionalized white fear functioned as the social structure's predisposition for insulating itself from the gale of Black non-performance. Coates framed fear as a kind of power. In the case of Ferguson, white fear became the power and might of the United States military, purposed with controlling the mobility of free Black bodies. As numerous historical accounts have illustrated, there need not be an uprising or a protest for Black bodies to come under paramilitary surveillance. Declaring war on such social constructs as drugs, poverty, crime, and terror have substantiated white fear projected onto the racialized lower class other in the name of saving the federalist state from erroneous internal or external threats. A portraiture of existing without the protection of the law, Coates calls it, quote, the correct and intended result of policy, end quote, while incessantly under the scrutiny of it. The cultural ethos of the American marketplace of ideas is to glorify the one, the singular, the exceptional individual. Coates, ruminating on the potency of individualism and the sustainability of exceptionalism, wrote, perhaps one can make a change, but not the kind of change that would raise your body to equality with your countrymen. Legal theorist Kimberly Crenshaw offers an alternative to Coates' notion by further suggesting intersectionality as a process with which to analyze violence, not only across social identities, but across various struggles. A fundamental component of the Black cultural ethos is to cherish oral histories, or as Crenshaw describes, consistently remember, rehearse, and retell. And intersectionality of struggles would mean that one could not tell the story of state-sanctioned violence against Black people in the United States unless, as Angela Davis submits, that one simultaneously tells the story of the genocidal colonization of Native Americans and the fear, the white fear, which enabled it. In accordance with this analysis of white fear contributing to racial injustice concerning identity, human rights, law enforcement, and non-performance, I've concluded that non-whites have only some claim on fear in the United States, aside from that which is projected onto them by whiteness. Whiteness has monopolized the normative nature of fear which emerges for coping with threats to survival, thus rendering it white fear. Non-performance, the opposing of white fear by existing, resistance, and critical refusals, is a demonstration which has historically resulted in the synchronized progress of anti-racism, the advancement of racism, and the plunder of Black bodies. A key consideration in scrutinizing whether or not non-performance defeats its purpose is if in doing so, the non-performing individuals meet their demise. Simply put, no. Non-performance is the most African response, the most indigenous response, the most humane response to real or imagined white fear, whether institutional or individual. The relation of white fear to United States American institutions is debated by scholars, but what is fact is that what stitches our country together is a series of compromises that are continually being tested, and consensus to a dream interconnected to white fear, the so-called American dream, and the struggle which exists in parallel to it. In terms of institutionalized white fear in the human rights context, Article 2, Section 7 of the United States Charter, the Domestic Jurisdiction Clause, prioritizes state sovereignty over human rights, hindering the UN, the United Nations, from intervening. Jurisdiction debates may have become a distraction from resolving important transnational issues, such as racial injustice and genocide. Yet there are still opportunities for global citizen solidarities rooted in the intersectionality of struggle and non-performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Abena. That was amazing. And I think a beautiful compliment to my presentation as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. Can't wait for the question and answer period so that we can get into it. All right, so let me share my screen. Perfect. All right, hopefully everyone can see this. My presentation today is entitled Dialogue Across Division. Please use dialogues for community peace building. And this is based on my master's research. It was one portion of a much broader kind of research question that I engaged in, but a small but important aspect that I'm excited to share with you all today. So a little bit about myself. I did just complete my master's of social science in peace mediation and conflict research at Tampere University in Finland. My thesis and my research focused on Gainesville, Florida, and the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building. I went down there and interned and engaged in interviews as my data for my research. And then since graduating, I've actually been hired by the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building. So now I'm a managing director there. So I get to share a little bit about some of our practices that we engage in. So a little bit about the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building. We are a community-based organization in Gainesville, Florida, North Central Florida. And we provide practices and tools to the community to empower them and to create what we call community-based peace building. So interpersonal conflict and local systemic conflict. And so what that looks like is that we focus on restorative justice, trauma, responsive approaches, social emotional learning, and then what is most relevant to this talk today, also dialogue. So my research started with this question about everyday peace. And some of you may be already familiar with the concept of everyday peace, and some of you may not have heard of it yet. But everyday peace in its simplest term is the concept, the understanding of how peace and conflict emerges in people's everyday lives. It's a recognition that in small but meaningful moments of interpersonal interaction, of shared space, of social and contextualized norms, peace or conflict manifests into the lives of community members. And so it manifests in this space that we can call the everyday. And Helen Berentz kind of best defines this space as the site within which people affected by conflict and insecurity engage with ongoing difficulties and challenges of building and sustaining routines in the face of institutionalized marginalization and disregard, and which has the potential for small but potentially radical change while perpetuating everyday rhythms of relationships, practices, and roles. So then everyday peace really is a research lens, but it's also a kind of theory of change. From the research side, it's the focus, the attention on how conflict, not between nations, but how it actually manifests into community members' lives, what it means for them in buses, in grocery stores, in their families. And then it's also the recognition that local contextualized actors facing conflict find unique and meaningful ways to engage with that conflict that promotes peace, that promotes coexistence or liberation. And so it's a research lens to focus on those areas of peace building. But then as a theory of change, it's also this recognition that top-down imposed structures of peace building tends to have a spotty record. And maybe, in fact, peace itself is a bottom-up approach. It emerges from people's daily lives. It emerges from their daily routines. And we can engage local people and empower them to build peace in a meaningful and sustained way. And this is what's led to the so-called local turn in peace research and peace building efforts. So if anyone's interested in this, Oliver Richmond, Roger McGinty, and Helen Berentz are great sources of information, great theorists and researchers. So here in my context, I live in Gainesville, Florida, and Gainesville, Florida is located in Alachua County, and it was also the site of my research. There are many social dynamics at play in Gainesville and Alachua County, but today, for the sake of this talk, we're going to focus on just one, which is DMC, which stands for disproportionate minority contact. And what this refers to specifically is the disproportionate minority contact of law enforcement, and specifically of youth. So in Alachua County, the numbers are stark. Here in our county, while Black youth represent 29.3% of the population, they make up over 83% of arrests. And if you can see the numbers actually go up as you go down the list there. So 93% of Black youth of youth in residential commitment are Black youth. And at the top, you can see our RRI scores, which stands for Relative Rate Index. And the statewide average is 3.1, which means that in the state of Florida, Black youth are 3.1 times more likely to be arrested than white youth. And in Alachua County, that number is 9.6. So 9.6 times more likely to be arrested than white youth. And that makes us the 4th worst county in the state with regard to RRI. So as part of the recognition that this is a problem, and it continues to be a problem, it's a sustained problem, the Gainesville Police Department, the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, and the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building started a new program that they called the Police Youth Dialogue. And it was introduced as a part of a broad strategy to address DMC, reduce juvenile arrests overall, with the recognition that this would have a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities, decrease the trust gap between community members and law enforcement, and increase safety, both for community members and for officers. And so these dialogues were based on the Bohemian model of dialogue. And to date, RPCP has conducted over 120 of these dialogues, and that has included over 1,200 officers and 2,000 youth. So we're having a pretty broad impact. And I'm going to share a video here. The reason we're sharing this video, this is kind of a promotional video for the Police Youth Dialogue, but for the sake of this talk, it does show some of the people that I interviewed as part of my research. Micah Johnson, Jeffrey Weisberg, Will Halvosa, you'll see those people in the video. And it also gives a sense of what these dialogues look like in practice, because we're going to talk more about the process here in just a second.
The badge, law enforcement, it represented something very negative, something very violent. As a child, if the only time you see these people is when they come to take things, then you see them and you greet them as the takers, the conquerors. As a Black male dealing with law enforcement, we feel this way. We knew that that badge meant something bad could happen to someone that we cared about.
So the conflict that exists between our African-American, Black and brown community members and law enforcement is not new. It's been happening for the last several hundreds of years. And yet it's so highlighted right now through the media. These tensions can have life or death consequences. And so we felt that it was really important to bring young Black and brown youth together with cops.
I look at it like it's just too much misjudging going on. They're judging a lot of books by their covers and not noticing what people really have came from. Have you feeling like, why am I even born to even go through this?
I've been that person stopped by the police, and I've been that person that felt, like justice was just not right, or my treatment versus that it was not right.
They tend to judge, like everybody judge. And when I felt misunderstood is when the police didn't really allow me to talk.
The citizens have to be retrained, and so does law enforcement. And saying retraining them is just changing our way of thinking. Once you've had more positive experience than the negative, and you learn not to live off of the stereotypes, then we can make some real headway.
So what have you guys heard about this thing we're doing tonight?
Actually, we haven't heard nothing but,
You haven't heard anything? No, you don't know anything yet. We are hoping to affect some change by building some relationship between police officers and community. To witness these dialogues is truly a miracle, because you can feel the tension and sense that dynamic that exists. So much resistance for both these groups coming together. And within the first half an hour, we're introducing ourselves and playing a game and kind of unpacking these ideas that keep those groups separate. And to see the bonding and the laughter and the understanding and the forgiveness and the tolerance that emerges for both of these groups is something that is so inspiring to observe and to witness. It gives all of us a lot of hope for moving this conversation and these relationships forward.
I would redefine my role as a police officer and recognize that my job wasn't just to arrest people, that my job was to provide services and to be a social worker and to be a role model. And so I think when you redefine the role of law enforcement, you'll start to see a change within your community. You'll start to develop legitimacy, and you'll start to develop trust.
I was actually invited to go and participate in the youth dialogue, and it broke down barriers that I didn't realize still existed with me as a deputy sheriff. That session really opened my eyes, and it was something that I realized that the La Chicana Sheriff's Office needed to embrace.
All right, so these dialogues, the objectives are kind of profound, but fairly simple at the same time. Really, they're there to build relationships and trust between police officers and youth, recognizing that there is a profound youth trust gap between community members and officers. They're there to generate, oh, and I want to be clear, the trust gap, I mean in both directions, to generate reflection and mutual understanding of concerns related to police youth or police community tensions, to reveal and dismantle assumptions and biases that may be present, to empower marginalized youth and center their voices. And of course, this is a really important piece too, to emphasize that the facilitators of these dialogues recognize that the power imbalance that exists between adult officers and youth is profound. And so much of the dialogue is really about highlighting and empowering and centering those voices and bringing those into that space, allowing police to keep apprised of community needs, and lastly, re-envisioning the role and culture of policing, which speaks to what Will Halvosa was saying at the end of that video. So the process that these participants, community members, and officers go through, they start off in separate groups. The youth are in one group and the officers are in another group. Both are given some kind of context about the event, about like their engagement. The officers are given some training around DMC, about implicit bias and about youth brain development. And the young people are invited to share their issues and concerns that they may have with police in their community. And then they both engage in this A to Z activity that we'll talk about in a second, where they write a list. Both groups are encouraged to write a list of descriptions that describe, in their words, the other group. So then they come back together. They play an opening game to kind of get everybody, to break the ice, to get everybody moving. And then they read those lists out loud, the A to Z lists, where people share their thoughts, their honest perceptions of the other group. And then obviously discussion ensues and is facilitated. Then the youth are able to present their issues and concerns, and especially in light of those A to Z lists, they take on new meaning and they're kind of delved deeper into, they navigate kind of and negotiate norms of engagement in the community. Then they share a meal together, and they look at their backgrounds, and they connect with each other personally in that way. They come back together and do a role play where the youth get to play the role of the arresting officer, and the officers get to play the role of someone being arrested. And then at the very end, in order to honor the wisdom and the insightfulness of the youth, they're invited to pose what we call a meaningful question. So they pose something that they want to know of either officers or just adults in general. And RPC collects these meaningful questions in a group. And then at the very end, we allow participants the chance to offer appreciations either of each other or the process. And so this A to Z list, we're going to look at an example of one of those right now. But first, just to kind of think about the process of how this activity works, I took this quote from my research, from my interview. This is Dr. Micah Johnson. He says, they literally have to confess what they think of folks. And once it's on paper, I think people begin to see, oh, that's not fair. And after exchanging and seeing the humanization of people, seeing that they are warm-blooded people that have fears, they have insecurities like everyone else, they have responsibilities, they have families, that also begins to break down some of that perspective of who these people are, youth and police officers. So here's, when I did my research for my thesis, I observed one of these dialogues, and this was the list that was created by the officer group to describe youth in the community. And I'll just kind of leave it up there for a second so everyone can kind of see it, see some of the things that came up. And you will notice that some confliction, and you'll notice that on both lists. And we'll talk about this in a second. And then this was the list that the officers, or sorry, the youth developed to describe the officers in their community and how they viewed them. You know, these stereotypes emerge in these moments. For the officers, oftentimes they have this perception of local youth as being, you know, troublemakers, not interested in their future, not interested in the community. And the conversation that ensues is a chance for youth to say, well, no, like, you know, I have goals, I have dreams for my life, I have responsibilities. And that tends to really broaden and change the dynamic of the officer's perception of the local youth. And the youth, you know, for K, for example, killers always comes up. And it allows officers the chance to share the fact that, you know, the vast majority you know, in our local police department, at every dialogue that I've been to, every officer has been able to say, I've never fired my weapon. And so this idea that the youth have that they're all always out killing people begins to be dismantled. And so since we've started this, in addition to other programs that are designed to reduce DMC and reduce juvenile arrests, we have seen a 78% reduction in youth arrests in Gainesville since that time. And we've seen a 95% reduction in school arrests across the board. So that has a real impact on outcomes for our local youth. And then kind of back to researcher brain here. So, you know, in this idea of everyday peace, these police youth dialogues represent kind of a chance to observe, you know, everyday interaction forming a peaceful kind of paradigm or a peaceful norm of engagement. You know, we have all of these like national or international narratives around, you know, policing and around communities. And in the dialogues, those things get distilled down, not into like the things we see and hear about, but the actual, you know, ways that they manifest in our day-to-day lives. And so these stereotypes, both of officers and of youth, are deconstructed, again, not through like abstract data, but by person-to-person communication. Because in these dialogues, you know, their interaction, their coexistence between officers and youth is not some abstract discussion. It's a reflection of people's actual lived experience. And the facilitator's aim is to create this kind of brave, sanctuary-like space where vulnerability can be held. Because vulnerability of officers is not allowed in the you know, out on the street, and vulnerability of young people is not allowed out on the street. So these spaces where vulnerability can be shared. And importantly, all of this really raises interesting new questions for peace researchers about, you know, what is the role of, you know, community organizations, small grassroots community organizations? What is their role in sustaining and developing and holding space for everyday forms of local peace? So if you're interested in this topic, do check out this book, The Little Book of Police Youth Dialogue. Dr. Micah Johnson and Jeffrey Weisberg, the executive director of RPCP, recently published the book. And it goes into the history of policing, and it goes into more depth about the process. But thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Abena and Eric, for these thoughtful and wonderful presentations. I'm so excited to lead us into the question and answer portion of this panel. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. And Kaya, our host, will help me to see the questions so that we can get them to our panelists. So I'll give you a second to think of those, and then we'll jump right in. In the meantime, I have one question for you both. Both of you sort of thought through these interesting manifestations of power and how they show up both through the white fear that Black non-performance opposes and summons, and the nuances of everyday peace building through police-youth dialogues. How did your study complicate your thoughts about power or make you think about power more generally? And what can peace studies and racial justice scholars and practitioners learn from these understandings of power?
Well, I guess I can try to answer that question first. This research and all of the reading involved in, and learning involved in understanding non-performance, it really intrigued me in terms of power. Power is whoever has power has ownership and has control. And so non-performance is a way to, at risk of peril, it's a way to say to power, no, power can be distributed or redistributed. So I suppose in terms of rethinking what power looks like, power itself, the idea of power to me is steeped in whiteness. And that's not a way to sustain our way of life, is to have misdistributed power. So the research will continue because there's so much more underneath all of these layers, and I'm looking forward to really diving deeper and seeing what else can be uncovered. Thank you.
I totally agree with everything just said, and I would add that, from the perspective of everyday peace, and especially these police youth dialogues, the very concept of community is about power sharing, and when power imbalances are present, there's really not a community there, So by building community, what you're doing is you're equalizing power, and by equalizing power, what you're doing is building community. So part of these dialogues, for example, that is, one of the very, very main objectives is how can you recognize this power imbalance? Many community members don't even recognize it due to their privileged position in that society. And so how can you recognize that power imbalance? And then how can you empower those voices? Because that's how you build and sustain a community that's strong and resilient.
Thank you both. And sorry, everyone, I misspoke. Please put your questions in the Q&A function if you see that, not the chat box. But we do have one question in the Q&A that I'll read. This is a comment and question for Abena. First of all, your fans here in Des Moines were so glad to see you share your scholarship in this forum. Second, I see non-performance as a new way to think about resistance to institutional and cultural power. I wonder if you could say more about how to distinguish non-performance from non-compliance or even resistance itself. Thank you so much, Megan, for this question.
Great question. Thank you, Professor Brown. That's Professor Brown. So in the research for understanding non-performance, I looked at Fred Moten and his scholarship regarding non-performance. And a specific situation that he referenced was an enslaved woman named Betty, who was brought with her enslavers from the South to the North. And so when she arrived at the North, she wanted her freedom. And so her case went to court and they litigated and the court granted her freedom. Now I want to pause here and say that Betty's family, her husband and extended family were still in the South. But for some reason, only she was allowed to go with the enslavers to the North. So back to the story. The court granted Betty her freedom, and then Betty made a choice that shocked everyone. Her enslavers were going to go back to the South. They were in the North on business. So if Betty was to go ahead and embrace that action of being granted her freedom, then what would she lose out on? She would lose out on being reunited with her family who remained enslaved in the South. So her act of non-performance was to not perform the duty of freedom that she had been given. She chose non-performance, which was to remain enslaved so that she could be reunited with her family in the South. So in that context, non-performance was choosing not to be free. Because if freedom is about choice, and intellectually, we all like to think that we would choose freedom, but there are nuances and there are costs associated with every choice. And Betty chose to remain enslaved because it was more important for her to be connected to her family than for her to be free by herself. So non-performance, the line between non-performance and non-compliance is blurred because the nuances are going to be what really decides what an individual decides to do. It's the freedom to choose not to be free. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. We have another question for both panelists. In thinking about potential connections or disconnections between each paper, I'm wondering if the panelists could offer reflections on where non-performance and vulnerability might meet or possibly be in tension. The dialogues described by Eric draw partly on the concept of vulnerability. I'm wondering how an oppressed community might gain enough trust to enter into a process requiring such vulnerability. Thank you for this question.
Yeah, maybe I'll speak first to this and then you can follow up with any thoughts you might add to it. So like for me, the vulnerability that I'm talking about is the tenuousness of truth telling. It's being able to be in a space of radical authenticity. And that is a vulnerable space. It's a space that is a difficult space to inhabit, especially if you're on the lower end of a power imbalance. So with that kind of thinking in mind, I mean, just the very writing on a whiteboard and showing it to a group of officers that we describe you as assholes, right? That is in its own way kind of a kind of non-performance. I would say. Maybe you disagree if you did think differently, but you are sharing a kind of a realistic yet difficult to hear perception with the group, and so the safety that's cultivated in that space is what allows that to happen. And so I think that there is a real connection here. Actually, I think that vulnerability is not just being open to attack, but it's about stripping away the barriers that we that keep us from being as honest and as authentic with the other side, especially when there's a systemic form of oppression present. Being as honest as we can about what we see and what we understand.
Eric, I think your presentation was so phenomenal. To have young people who have had disproportionate contact with law enforcement and then law enforcement officers share space and time and talk seems like a good idea. I want to just propose another thought along with that is, in my presentation, I mentioned that there are 5 components to the criminal legal system. So the police, law enforcement that's only one component. We have, the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorneys, we have the court, and we have mechanisms for incarcerating and enclosing people. So while those conversations are necessary and they are impactful, and they do raise awareness and inform the other parties of how other people think and feel, I think it's important to really think about ways to include the entire legal system in that process, because as much work has been done around completing or filling in a gap between police and community, there is a gap between community and court. There's a serious conversation to be had between community and mechanisms for incarcerating and enclosing people. So I think if we would broaden our scope, I think we'd have a more comprehensive conversation. There's a more comprehensive conversation to be had, which in turn, it would raise the awareness and understanding of the power structure, while at the same time potentially offering more opportunities for community to find ways to assert non-performance as resistance.
We have another question that says, thank you both, Abena and Eric, for your presentations. I am struck with the common theme of dignity and upholding dignity in the face of oppression at the heart of both non-performance and interstructural dialogue. With dignity also entwined with human rights, what are your views on these types of actions to protect dignity and therefore highlight disparity in human rights recognition in the face of oppression?
That is a tough question. And I say that simply because my thinking is dignity is something that is associated with being a human. And so human rights is not something that anybody should have to ask for. If we have to ask for it, then we're never going to get it. So if we have to assert our dignity all the time, then, I feel like that's an admission that we are not human almost. So I think it's a question of dominant culture and what are the narratives that support and prop up dominant culture, and then who benefits from those narratives, who's harmed by those narratives, and then who is silenced so that those narratives can prevail. When we answer those questions, we all have dignity.
Yeah, I would just add to that too, that, when we can speak truth, we inherently preserve our dignity. When we can, when we can counter those narratives through lived experience, by sharing who we are and what we know to be true from our lives, that inherently, protects our dignity and asserts our dignity. And so that in and of itself is really the way to ensure that those rights, if we want to call that, are recognized.
You would think after so long on Zoom, I'd be a pro at Zoom, but there's always some technical difficulties. I think there was a question in the chat, and I'm not sure if it made it to the Q&A. So if it did not, Kaya, please let me know. But in the meantime, I had a question for both of you to consider. I know in my PhD training, we talk a lot about scholar practitioners and what it means to be a scholar practitioner, and both of you do that work. So one of the questions I had was just sort of, how do you think about the relationship between both of those sort of positionalities? And what advice would you give to students or to anyone who wants to be a scholar and practitioner?
I've never thought of myself as a scholar practitioner before, so this is kind of this is like a new term for me. But for me, I can only speak for myself. For me, the theory, the research, it all kind of loses any kind of real meaning for me at the moment that we don't see it in the world. And so for me, being able to work with communities in conflict, be able to, hold space, be able to empower voices. For me, that work is not like a complement to my research. It's why I did the research. So what advice would I give? I would say that, apply your learnings. I think that it's important.
Well, thank you, Eric. You totally helped me there, because I haven't heard that phrase before, scholar practitioner, but I guess by definition, we certainly do that. And I'm honored to have that understanding today. For me, my entire life is an act of non-performance. The fact that I can wake up and get out of bed and move about a city that's predominantly white and be in spaces where I was told I did not belong and could not have access is an act of non-performance. If it was a badge, I would wear it proudly every single day. And so the work that I do with Sankofa Literary and Empowerment Group, there was a saying that I heard a lot growing up: if you want to hide something from Black people, put it in a book. So the work that I do in Sankofa Literary and Empowerment Group is about disproving that idea. No, if there is a book, we're going to read it. We're going to discuss it. We're going to deconstruct it. We're going to try to write the author and ask questions about this book and these topics. And then to dispel the notion that children from certain zip codes or from certain types of communities or family constructs can't learn, then we launched Sankofa Literary Academy, a literacy program after school for 3rd and 4th grade students, to show that all children are indeed intelligent, even the ones that are labeled the worst performing readers in a school. So non-performance, in my estimation, is absolutely necessary for a person of color to be able to have activated in their lives, especially if they live in the United States of America. So should we all be scholar practitioners? Absolutely. And university is not the only place to be educated. Before I became a non-traditional student at Drake University, I was a lifelong learner in the community. So there are ways that we can all gain access to scholarship and then put those lessons to use and to practice in our communities. And I just encourage everyone to do just that.
Thank you both for those answers. Today I heard a quote: "A scholar is a person in your neighborhood." And I think you both embody that value. So thank you so much for your work. We have a question for Eric. How do you imagine the wide-scale implementation of police-youth dialogues in communities all across the country? Do you think this is a plausible objective or a bit too far beyond our reach as a society right now?
I tend to be a glass half full kind of guy. So I definitely see the possibility. But I also would say that, you know, every community is different. So this is something that our community, that has emerged from our community. And we're happy to share it with other communities that maybe it's a benefit to them. And if so, fantastic. You know, that's amazing. We also recognize that it's the dynamics are going to be a little different everywhere you look. So, so in that way, is it plausible? I honestly, I don't know. I don't really know. But I do think the impact. I mean, I want to come back to something Abena said earlier, which was that, you know, the relationship between the community and police is just one dynamic that we need to explore. So that is absolutely true. But it's also a really important dynamic. And so, so the more that we can engage, I think we do have this general faith that the more we can engage in active truth telling, in sharing of experience, in dismantling of like kind of our assumptions and our biases of each other, the better. So we would definitely encourage that. And honestly, we're here to support anybody that wants to implement something like this in your community. Reach out to me, Eric at centerforpeacebuilding.org, anytime. You know, we'd love to have a conversation just to support that process, because we do believe in it. But it does depend space to space.
So I just want to give space if anyone has any last questions. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm glad I said that. Okay, here we go. All right, another fan from Des Moines. I'm so happy I know how to say Des Moines right now. With a follow-up question. Abena spoke about the need to expand these dialogues beyond the police to other institutions of law. How can we take this sort of initiative into the culture even more broadly to transform the culture that leads white communities to seek over policing of Black communities?
So I'm sure Eric can chime in on this too. I think it begins with a really sweeping initiative of self-awareness. I think we have to all get to the place where we understand the importance of addressing race from a personal, immediate, and local perspective before attempting to address it at a group or societal level. There is something to be said for trying to fix a problem that we only see as existing outside of ourselves. And so I think it will first begin with some self-awareness and understanding our own racialized experiences, because we've all had them. And then once we understand our own racialized experiences based on our upbringing and all different sorts of things that factor into that, then we can look at the institutions and systems that we support and figure out what we've done to create them in the manners in which they function, and then find those holes and address it. But we really can't do that successfully unless we address, you know, the internalized racist within, or the internalized oppression within. We have these things working within our psyches, and to attempt to address fixing systems without fixing the self, or seeing the self in totality, I think is a historical mistake, and a mistake that if we continue to make, will prove to be unsustainable.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that helped me kind of clarify my thinking too when you said that. So for me, you know, it's absolutely true that there's no 10-point plan. You know, we're going to get from here to there, and we're going to solve white supremacy. It's not going to happen like that. So it is this constant, ongoing, cyclical, churning process of reflection on all levels. And so one of the things that we talk about at the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building, and this came up in my research, was this idea of the social ecological model that starts with the self, the self in the center, we have, you know, kind of our immediate relationships after that, expanding into communities, into systems, into, you know, policies and procedures and cultural norms. And so supremacy and power imbalance exists at each stage of that model. Right? And so that means that each stage is always influencing the others, always at the same time. And so our work as peace builders, as, you know, peace researchers, our work is to do that reflective work and that active, you know, empowerment work at each stage of that social ecological model at the same time, which is not an easy task. But it's certainly true, as Abena said, that it starts within, right? We can't ignore that part if we're going to look at the systems part. That's it's always going to be there, and so it all has to be looked at the same time.
Can I just say that, Eric, I like the way you think.
Right back at you.
I'm loving all the love. So much love in this space. So I want to give one more space for any last questions, and then I'll make the closing remarks. So I'll just give about 30 seconds. And if you got something to say it. I know that wasn't 30 seconds, but you know, if you put a question in after I make my remarks, we'll make room for that. But I want to give our wonderful panelists a little break. So many thanks for joining us in study and in discussion around racial justice and reimagining what racial justice can mean. I want to give a special thank you for such thoughtful questions and engaging with the presentations. I believe we are all leaving with more considerations, questions, and ideas from this wonderful panel. I want to thank Abena and Eric for their time and excellent presentations. Thank you to the students who planned this hybrid conference. I know that this is the first time it's been hybrid, so you know, technology abounds. And our wonderful host, Kaya Morton, for handling all the Zoom logistics and helping me stumbling through. Although we have finished the Q&A session, feel free to continue with questions and discussion in the networking video rooms that I think is next right after this. Everyone have a great weekend. And remember, it's internal as well as the external work. Thank you all.